Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database, and I publish the weekly school shooting data analysis and reports Substack. Anytime we talk about school shootings, gun violence at schools, or gun violence in general, a big part of that discussion is policing. And overall, police departments are really low performing organizations. And what I mean by that is that police departments are very expensive. They're usually the second highest item on a municipal budget. There's very high risk for both the officers and all of the people that they encounter. They deal with a small number of repeat offenders over and over at a high cost. And ultimately, a lot of their activities have little impact on crime. So, how you take a low performing organization and make it high performing is usually based on data analysis. You get your data, you quantify your problem, and then you start measuring the ways that different interventions get you towards a solution to that problem. The guest on the show today is an expert in crime data analytics. Jeff Asher is the co founder of Data Analytics, and he publishes weekly and monthly updates about real time crime all over the country. Jeff, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what got you into analyzing crime data? Because there is anybody who's an expert in data analytics can make money in so many ventures now. You could be in sports and gambling and stocks and finance and business process. What got you into crime data, and why did you decide to center your career around that?
I didn't realize I could do all of these other things. I thought this was the only subject matter available to me. No, I was with, I'm from New Orleans originally, was born and raised. Went to the University of Texas for my undergrad, moved up to DC, worked for the federal government as an analyst for 7 years or 6 years, and was moving back home. If you're up in DC, everybody's got a master's degree. Everybody can do 6 ways to Sunday analysis and write and think and all of these things. And in New Orleans, we don't do that for anything. With crime and gun violence being kind of the big issue that it seemed like it was most in need of correction. And so I got the mayor's office to create a crime analyst position within the police department, which was the first time in decades they'd had a crime analyst. I used to say that it was the first crime analyst they've ever had until somebody sent me an article from like the 60s where it was like police department using computers to predict crime or something like that. So I was like, oh, they had analysts before. So, but really, probably since the 90s, they hadn't had anybody that they called an analyst. And so I did that for not very long. It wasn't something that the department I thought was very well suited to using in any systemic way. And so I started consulting and knowing that nobody was necessarily approaching the data and just as a data infrastructure challenge and an analysis challenge. Typically, when you get crime analysts, they almost all work for police departments. And when they work for police departments, they're usually deployed to look at really small tactical issues. And I knew that the issues that we have are big and managerial and strategic. And so that's sort of what I've been doing. And having worked for large organizations my whole life, nobody had ever heard of me. And I knew that I needed to build a profile in order to build a business. And so I started writing and started at 538 10 years ago, and it's gone from there.
I had no idea that you were part of 538. My dream guest for the podcast at some point is Nate Silver. So we'll see what happens. But you're essentially the crime Nate Silver out there, like crunching crime data in ways that nobody else is. But I think kind of the foundation of this discussion is the layperson. You see that there's data from the FBI, police departments publish crime stats, some big departments have kind of data driven policing, but it's all based on official data. And a lot of that comes out a year or 2 or 3 years delayed. From what you've seen, like what are the biggest flaws that people don't realize that exists in kind of your official data on crime?
The biggest flaws are that it's like the nature of it is the biggest flaw. That one, we know that the numbers are wrong. Maybe we do a good job, or we certainly do the best job in counting murders. Even murders, like one agency's justifiable homicide is another agency's murder. And so even those, we don't do a perfect job. If you compare it to baseball, like the ball left the bat, it left at a certain mile per hour that we can measure, it landed, the runner got a double. Those are like facts that we can measure. Can't do that with crime. And then you get into smaller incidents like theft, shopliftings, where 20%, 25% are maybe reported to the police each year. Maybe that's even high. And so we inherently don't know that our numbers are correct. We kind of are hoping that our numbers are consistently flawed, that one year we don't have a surgeon reporting because the flaws got fixed. But sometimes that's the case. And then you get into just agencies that we ask a lot of police departments, and typically tracking these kinds of things is not always the thing that they're best at. So one agency, Columbus, Ohio, just came out that they had 160 or 100,000 cases that they hadn't yet processed. And so they were underreporting data to the FBI each year. And this is actually something that we found through our audit in the Real-Time Crime Index. We had a meeting with them and we said, all right, we know the data you're sending to Ohio isn't good. Can you give us the correct data? Because I see this chart and I see it like falling off a cliff. And they're like, wait, there's a problem. And so to their immense credit, they looked at it and saw, oh, we have a problem. Let's start solving it. And it was one of those situations where it wasn't like the public blows something up and then they start to act, and they act defensively. They were very aggressive about solving the problem. How many of those situations exist that we don't know of? And so I don't know how long you have scheduled for this talk, but I could probably spend all of it talking about the various flaws in crime data and still not hit all of them. So I'll stop there, and if others come up, we'll jump in on those.
No, I mean, it's absolutely true. You can spend hours on it. I mean, any research methods class in a criminology or criminal justice program, you spend an entire semester just digging into a couple issues with data, and just so people can realize the real world impacts of having under over reporting or not really knowing what your picture is so say a police department thinks that there's an issue with motor vehicle thefts, and they create a motor vehicle task force, and then you see a change in the rate. Well, if you didn't really know what it was before and you didn't really know what it was after, you're actually not sure if your task force did anything useful or not. And then to compound that, police departments tend to mirror each other. So you might have a program that's rooted in misunderstanding data that looks really successful in one jurisdiction. And the next thing you know, you have other jurisdictions all over the country mirroring that same program. And the whole thing could be rooted in either a problem or a solution that did or didn't exist to the degree that the data shows. And so it's that same thing with baseball. If you don't know whether there are strikes or balls or home runs, you don't know if any of the players on your team are any good. And that's kind of an issue that exists across policing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The challenge is, and we didn't even talk about the challenge of like proving causality. Whenever things go up, you'll see police departments across the country that talk about how they don't control it. If somebody decides to murder somebody else, they can investigate it, they can respond to it, they can make an arrest, they can support the prosecution. They can't control that. And then when things go down, the police departments talk about all of the ways that they're controlling it. And you see that constantly. And there are a handful of strategies that we know work, that have the research behind them. But frequently you'll see like the claims of when we see national trends, everything's going up, everything's going down. You have 1,000 police departments or law enforcement agencies talking about 1,000 different solutions that they've tried that must be the answer, because otherwise things wouldn't have gone down. And so it's very difficult not only to measure, but to measure impact and to measure the effect of policy.
And then also, official crime data is almost always delayed. If there's a high performing kind of city department, they might have weekly or monthly or quarterly stats. A lot of departments just have quarterly or annual stats. At a state level, you're probably only gathering one annual state level report, just because of the amount of information that and effort that needs to go into collecting that. And then nationally, when the FBI puts out national crime data, it's usually 2 years delayed. So if you're trying to do all of these dynamic adjustments to policing in real time, you're changing the play based on what somebody was calling 2 years ago in the NFL. Um,
Well, you see this in the discussions in the 90s. I mean, in 1995, when crime was plunging, it had already peaked. It was going down in 94. It was, by this point, especially in a lot of big cities. Like things had been the worst they were going to be and were going down. You saw all of these discussions, testimonies in front of Congress, articles talking about how things are getting worse and they're going to continue to get worse until you get tougher on crime. And things had already started to get better. And I think that, similarly, we're going through massive sudden changes in the last 5 years across a variety of crimes. And so if you aren't able to measure it, then you're kind of SOL. Like if you can't solve anything that you can't measure. There's a really great quote I can read. Whenever I give a presentation, I love to start with this. In the past few years, the control of crime has been an absorbing topic before the American public. It has been taken for granted by many that a crime wave exists. Neither the American public nor its regularly constituted authorities responsible for police, court, and correctional activities have any reasonably complete and accurate knowledge of the amount and cost of crime in this country, or whether it is increasing or decreasing. All of which means we are in the absurd position of endeavoring to diagnose and cure a social disease with little knowledge of its causes, its nature, and its prevalence. That was spoken by Detroit Police Chief William Rutledge in 1927. Like if he had said that today.
So 98 years ago, and it could be today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some degree we've improved, but yeah, we're trying to solve an societal ill that we don't measure and understand.
Which brings us to what you've created, which is a real-time crime database to address a bunch of these issues. So first, kind of where did that idea come from? And then how did you operationalize it? Like, where's this information coming from?
Yeah, so I started doing this in 2016 with the idea that if you get cities that are publishing their data for the first time ever, the internet has made it possible to get their data in near real time. And if you sample enough of them, you can reasonably predict what's going to happen. Now, there's a margin of error, and the more cities you have in your sample, the better or the lesser your margin is. But in general, if you get 30, 50, 75 cities, you can be within 3 to 5 percentage points of where the murder change is going to be. So if you say murder is down 3% in your sample, it's probably, down a little bit or about even. This is particularly useful like 2020, murder up 30%, 2023, 2024 down 10 to 15%. Easily measured, easily seen. Even if we don't know the exact numbers, we can basically shortchange the slowness of the data, acknowledging that the data is always imperfect, that we're never going to be correct, even if we have exactly the reporting that the FBI has. So let's be fast because there's value in going fast. And so I was having coffee April 2023 with Jen Doliak, who runs criminal justice for Arnold Ventures. And I don't even think she had started that position yet, but we're just talking about like general ideas of ways to improve crime data. And this idea came up. And then we pitched it to Arnold Ventures and they agreed to fund it. And so they've been supporting it we started last January. I guess this is probably the first time I've talked about it publicly, but we got an expansion recently to basically take all of the old data. So we have real-time data. Our goal is 500 to 1,000 agencies. We have about 450, 460 agencies of data. This last month, about 350 of them had available current year data through January. January data being a little bit weird. So I imagine that will go up and we'll be close to 400 not too long. And so there we're able to basically measure and update historical data so that we're able to see crime trends as they occur. At the same time, we're building an expansion that will essentially take all of the old data. Most people don't know this, but the FBI has historical data back to 1930. It's in scanned in PDFs. It's never been digitized. The stuff that they do have on the Crime Data Explorer, most of it requires some coding skill. It's difficult to access. So we're basically going to take that and put it in a repository where hopefully anybody can access and see trends historically from 1930 to the most recent year. And then in real time, basically what's happening now. And hopefully be, one of a kind, unique crime data repository that people can use for years to come. So that's kind of the project we've been working on. It's very exciting. We can see the trends in a way that you can't really see, even if you're collecting year-to-date data on 50 cities or something like that.
And this may be getting a bit too nerdy, but the way that crime has been categorized over the last 100 years is there's probably a fair amount of changes in the categories of crime. Some things are different location to location. What are you doing to kind of normalize all of that old FBI data? Have you created new categories? Are you collapsing information into those categories? Are you, kind of writing your own set of descriptions around kind of what the different crime categories are? Or are you just going off the way that the FBI reported it?
We're going off the way the FBI is reporting it. The less we have to create, the better, more uniform it is. So the FBI created 7 main categories of crime. They added arson in the 70s, but it's very badly reported, so it's not even estimated nationally. So we're just taking those 7 categories and we're using them. And it allows us to, if you want to see robbery back to 1930 in Chicago, that data exists. You can go get it, and we're going to make it available, is kind of the idea. And it's the same definition that they've had since the 1930s. There are a few examples. Rape, they made about a decade ago, they made the definition of rape more inclusive. Male rape victims were not counted for a long time. And so it adds to that number, but they have also a legacy definition as well. So you can compare the old definition over time, or you can look at the new number and see this is how many incidents of the expanded definition we think there are.
So once you have all of that historical data kind of recoded and in your system and accessible, what can somebody do at the local level with that information? If say you're a state where you've got a bunch of the municipalities are providing real-time data in that state and you have 100 years of historical data, what can a police department do with that information that they can't do right now?
I think in theory, it puts the department, it gives them context for understanding we're seeing X happening. X is happening everywhere. So it's not unique that this is happening to us, or it's not happening anywhere. And we're seeing an increase where everywhere else is seeing a decrease. I don't know that police departments are inherently the number one customer I would foresee is using something like this, although I certainly think it could be helpful. I would think members of the media, policymakers, citizens, academics, it creates resources for all of those people. Certainly we want, we're partnering with police departments. We appreciate and need police department support and willingness to participate. But I don't know that they're inherently the ones getting that they're like the front line of who gets the most out of this. I will say with the Columbus example, we're doing an audit of your data in a way that the FBI and other sources are not. And so if there are data reporting problems, we can look at it and tell you. And we found numerous examples of that, which usually people aren't thrilled to hear your stuff is wrong, but it's important to know. And it's very rarely coming out of malice. It's usually out of tech is hard. So
Have you run into any issues with archival data? I think at the very start of the school shooting database, one of my goals was to get the actual police report for every one of the incidents. And when I started contacting departments, pretty much anything that happened before the 1990s, they didn't have records of anymore because records only need to be retained for 10 or 20 years in a lot of jurisdictions. And then also police departments in the last 30 years or so, they've gone from paper and carbon copy records to probably their first digital system that would have been um, a floppy disk type of system to a server to a better server to then things going to the cloud for the first time. And a couple departments I talked with just said like, oh yeah, during one of our digital transformations, we lost a huge amount of data. Have you seen or experienced that there are any kind of holes that are glaring in this effort to kind of put together historical data?
not yet, because we're mostly just going back to 2017. There are certainly places that didn't report data from the NIBRS transition in 2021. So there are places that, usually if it's like 2 or 3 months, we'll basically estimate what we think it was based on the average that they reported that month. And it's older data. It doesn't affect our understanding of current trends. It just helps to include an agency, and we're upfront about who we're doing that for and why. And that's a rare instance. For the most part, it's not an issue. When we start doing the historical issue look, there are years that certain states didn't report. There are our 1962, the FBI for like 8 states just lost the tapes. We don't have West Virginia crime data for 1962. It just doesn't exist anymore. So there are things like that that exist that are more trivial than really important as to whether or not Charleston, West Virginia reported a certain number of thefts. We can have a hole in the graph. That's fine. But for the most part, I think that it's generally reasonably complete to the point where we shouldn't have a ton of problems. And if the problems exist, then we'll just report them and annotate it. And that's kind of the goal.
So then now that you have this information together, what are the types of products that you're putting out kind of on a weekly or monthly or annual basis?
So I have a Substack that I put out that's more personal than company product, but that's the only thing that we do weekly. We do a monthly update of the real time crime index. We do that on a 45-day lag, 45 to 50-day lag. So we just put out the January data. Next mid-April we'll put out the February data, and the reason for that is that agencies tend to underreport the most recent month. So when they publish their February data in March, it's not complete. We don't want to publish it because they'll update it a ton. It'll always show this enormous decline. And
And
honestly,
that's just because police reports haven't been filed and completed
yeah,
yet.
they're not completed. They're not meant to be done this fast. It's just not the way the system operates. So by giving them an extra 30 days, we then we position ourselves to be able to generally be accurate. It'll change a little bit, but it shouldn't change so much that it like changes the entirety of the reporting. The numbers. So if we update all of the last 6 months of data, then we're capturing underreporting, which is more skewed towards the more recent months. And basically it gives us a decent picture of what's happening. And then 3 or 4 months from now, it should give us a mostly complete picture of what crime numbers in the sample were like. So it's a fluid situation as far as what reporting looks like.
So when I started the school shooting database, it was in February 2018. And when Parkland happened, right in that moment, you couldn't say how many shootings happened on campus this year, how many shootings happened on campus last year. Is there a trend that's going up or now or down? What are the trends with rampage attacks at schools? What's the who, what, where, when, why of these incidents? So kind of the impetus to start this project was in a 2-month period in 2018. There were 3 different deliberately planned attacks at schools in Marshall County, Kentucky, in Parkland, and then in Santa Fe, Texas. And then that seemed to be the start of a really growing trend with gun violence at schools, where there were fights in the hallways that were turning into shootings almost every day. On average, there was a shooting at a school, almost every day of the week for the last couple of years. And then in the last 6 months or so, all of a sudden there's been a pretty dramatic decline. And I've noticed from reading your Substack, which there will be a link to in the show notes here, you're seeing a decline in kind of violent crime nationwide. Can you kind of talk through that trend that you're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, starting really at the end of 2022, maybe start of 2023, we started to see what had been a really large increase in 2020 and 2021 and mostly stable in 2022. We start to see a decline, and 2023 featured the largest 1 year decline ever recorded. 2024 was probably bigger. And I don't know that there's inherently an explanation for why this happened. It's something that belies explanation, but you look at all sorts of incidents, and I mean, it makes perfect sense that you'd see fewer school shootings just because you're seeing fewer of everything. So you're seeing fewer mass shootings, you're seeing fewer murders, you're seeing fewer carjackings, you're seeing basically everything going down, which suggests that it's sort of big picture societal changes. And so even while people talk about how American society is going to hell and all of this, that people are killing each other less, and a lot less than they used to. And that doesn't mean that other problems don't exist, but it means that, and And I should also caveat that it doesn't mean that I'm saying that like this is an acceptable level of killing, that there's no progress to be made, that things can't get better. But the trend, if you're going to argue that things are getting worse, that's just inherently wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, in this last election cycle, there was a huge amount of rhetoric around gun violence in specific places. Looking, at the school data, I certainly don't see that. It's actually rural Southern and Midwest communities that have the highest rates compared to some of the high population cities like New York or Chicago. But just pulling up, a couple numbers that stood out to me. So looking at mass shootings nationwide, this is anytime four or more people are shot, from 2023 to 2024, that's down 24%. Mass murders, which are four plus victims killed in that same time period, 2023 to 24, is down 25%. And then looking at kind of the real time mass shooting data for this year, there have been about 48 mass shootings so far this year, which is on pace for a 20% reduction from 2024. So, I mean, we're looking at like all types of gun crime in all over the country being down in like the 20% to 40% reduction. I mean, that's really, really substantial without any clear policies or changes in policing or gun laws or sentencing or incarceration rates, all these different things that you think would be a measure of getting tough on crime. There's a huge drop without any changes there.
Yeah, and you look at the individual city shooting data. Louisville shootings down 35%, New Orleans down 63%, Portland down 45%, St. Louis down 56%, New York down 18%, Philly down 14%, Pittsburgh down 26%, Cincinnati down 17%, Chicago down 18%. And that's just this year compared to last year. Most of these places saw declines last year as well. Yeah, it's a remarkable trend. It's not something I can explain. I think it probably the lesson, hopefully the lesson is to take away is like, these things can happen without law enforcement harshness. Tough on crime does not have to be the answer to things getting worse. And given how national in scale these changes are, I think you can argue that it's sort of big national factors that are causing it. Now, what those factors are, I don't know. But certainly, I think that in general, you're seeing a lot of improvement in a lot of places. And so it's certainly a positive trend to be able to see.
And that's also backstopped by a lot of police departments are talking about the difficulty recruiting and retaining officers. I'm very familiar with Washington, D.C. That's where I'm from originally. And so I follow all the local news there. The Washington Police Department is below their kind of minimum acceptable staffing levels, yet somehow violent crime in the city is reducing, even though there have been less officers on the street for the last couple of years. So I think that what's really interesting about real-time data collection, because I watch a ton of sports, and the way that the game has changed in football and basketball and baseball the last couple of years has been almost completely based on really real-time data analysis, game to game adjustments, in-game adjustments, wholesale roster adjustments. You're doing those things based on the performance that you're measuring in real time. In policing, it's really interesting that crime is actually down at a point where your force is reduced to the lowest level that it's been in quite a few years. Do you have any thoughts around that, or how you would talk about these trends? Say if a police executive or a city official contacted you and said, like, help me kind of understand what's happening and how we can keep this momentum moving.
Your guess is as good as mine would be my general answer. I think it's really hard to say why. And I think there's a strong likelihood that there's very little that a lot of jurisdictions have done to cause it. If that's the case, then I think there's a likelihood that there's not a ton that agencies can do to keep the momentum going or to keep things going down. I think investing in strategies that you tend to know make sense and tend to work is the best solution. Things like, just throwing out summer jobs, focused deterrence has a generally positive outlook, especially in sort of short-term interventions. And I know there's a lot that goes with focused deterrence, and that's a whole big conversation. But there's a lot of different strategies that agencies can do. I think the best way to do it if I were to advise agencies, I wouldn't point to I would say set up a system where you can perform interventions and measure whether or not the interventions are being successful, and put resources behind the successful ones and don't put resources behind the ones that are unsuccessful. Try and fail quickly, as Jen Doliak likes to say. But that's not like helpful to police departments that are like, where do I put my officers? I can't answer that because I don't know that that's inherently what's going to drive it up or down.
Well, especially not with violent crime. There's some pretty strong empirical evidence around you can have some very focused, very localized reductions in property crimes based on things like hotspot policing. Overall, violent crime there's very little disruption of that. I mean, we've been talking about shootings quite a bit. Are there any interesting trends that you're seeing with property crime or other crime categories that are unexpected or also declining?
Well, certainly the reduction in auto thefts is the big one. Auto thefts surged between 2020 and 2023, really big increase, and they have since come down, and they're coming down fast. I think we have it at almost a 30% this year compared to last. In the summer of 2022, somebody put on social media how to steal certain models of Kia and Hyundai. And it led to this explosion in a lot of cities in auto thefts. And so,
For anybody who's not familiar with that, like it's been fixed now in most cases, but essentially you could use a USB drive to start a Kia car, not through the computer, just because the key hole in the dash was shaped in the same way as a USB drive. So basically, any USB could turn the Kia on. And there were pretty wild videos with the hashtag Kia Boys of kids all over the country just stealing and joyriding around in Kias. But I think this comes to like why it is so interesting to analyze this data and get into kind of the minutia of it, because the price of cars has increased dramatically over the past 10 years. And a car is normally something that is an item of utility. So you'd think, somebody's stealing a car because they can't buy a car, but they're stealing that car for some sort of utility to them. But fewer people can afford cars than could 5 years ago, yet somehow fewer cars are getting stolen. It's just, there are all these kind of unexplainable paradoxes that come out of this data.
And I mean, making it easy to steal them is not helpful. And in a lot of places, you saw like 100-200% increases in auto thefts almost overnight. And that is an insane increase. Agencies, I think, were poorly set up. It's not their fault that it increased, and it's not their fault that it ended up going down, I don't think. But you saw this enormous increase, and there's a finite number of Kias and Hyundais to steal, and now you're seeing a big decrease, and that's just sort of what happened.
And then is there anything else, or you think it's either a really interesting data point or it's just something that runs contrary to everything else that you're seeing?
Seeing this enormous decline is, I think, the thing that's most interesting. And how real is it? How far is it going to go down? I don't know the answers to those, but those are the things that I think about a lot that we don't necessarily know.
The last item to cover here is it kind of puts people like us in a strange place where we fill a really unmet need to quantify and understand a really acute specialized problem. I mean, you look broadly at crimes, that's kind of applicable everywhere. But I wanted to figure out the who, what, where, when, and why of school shootings, and then the broader trends with gun violence at schools. That is something that's starting to go down. So is it a problem that has been solved? I mean, we've consistently had a number of planned attacks at schools every school year, but it really is not occurring kind of at the rate that it used to. Looking at the really high profile mass shootings in public spaces, you have to go back to October 2023 to the Lewiston, Maine bowling alley and restaurant shooting as the last really high profile mass shooting. And that's 18 months ago. What do you see as what's kind of next for you in terms of growing more agencies as crime declines?
I mean, that's the hope, is that we continue to get more data, continue to get better data. I think that, to sort of the question that you started to ask, which is it solved? I think the answer is inherently know, especially an issue that if we don't know what's causing it, how do we possibly argue that we've fixed it? I think the the biggest question, we've kind of got sufficient data at this point. All we're doing is sort of helping to get more data to make things more obvious at the margins. But in general, I think that we've got enough data in enough cities to tell what crime trends are. The question is how much better and more efficient can we get at it? And I'm hopeful that the answer is much better and much more efficient. But I think that from my angle, I'm very self-satisfied with where we are in terms of just we had this blind spot and now we can see a little bit. And I think that that's real improvement.
Well, also, there are crime trends that we do solve and do stop. There's never kind of a clear date when they're over. But, when I've looked at the 60 years of school incidents, something that was much more prevalent in the 60s and 70s and 80s was deliberate hostage taking at schools. And there's been a lot of studies and training, and police departments across the country have hostage negotiators, which they didn't in the past. And there's excellent federal level training for every police department. And hostage situations, both at schools and then in lots of public places, have just kind of disappeared. The same with airplane hijackings. It seemed like at 9/11 and the couple of years after that we might run into small scale terrorist attacks at places all over the country. That hasn't happened. Bank robberies, which were huge in the 80s and 90s, are down dramatically from there. I think it's maybe a more kind of existential question, but with this real time data, you'll kind of be able to see when certain types of crime just become less prevalent.
Yeah, we're not measuring it, I think, at a level of granularity that would really let you say we've made this more prevalent, we've made progress on it. I think that we can see murder up or down, certain policies, whether or not they're working. We're not measuring bank robberies or specifically shoplifting or anything like that. So I think the level of granularity is a much higher than you'd want for like diagnosing all of these societal ills that you'd want to say like this is a very specific problem and we took steps to solve it. But like I think that with NIBRS, that level of granularity is possible, and I'm hopeful that maybe we can get there someday, just not necessarily through this project.
Do you think with AI tools, there's an ability to pull and match and code and compare crime data to a level of granularity that we've never had before into like a meaningful kind of regional or national level data set?
I don't know. I'm an AI skeptic, but I don't know if that like I don't want that to cloud my judgment, my assessment. So I guess the answer for me at least is I don't know, and it's possible, I guess, but I'd have to see it to believe it.
Yeah, I was thinking back to your description of all the FBI records that sit in those PDFs and how many police departments there are that just have reams of paper records or have tons of PDF archive documents or documents in all kinds of different formats. And the one thing right now that the current AI models are very good at is pulling and stitching together disparate information and pulling things like changing a PDF into specific details of it and putting it into a database format. So I think that could be the dream, that one day when you have these different pieces of data where you have your official police report, you have your state level reports, your federal report, but also you have all this front end data. Like almost every police department uses a computer assisted dispatch center where every single 911 call is being recorded, given a call type, you're getting a call response, you're getting a disposition. There is a path at some point in the future where you stitch all of those pieces of information together and you're getting a really kind of dynamic real-time picture of crime.
It's certainly plausible. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a technologist, so it's not something that I inherently think a ton about. Our problems are very like infrastructural and getting the basics right. And so maybe those are solutions that can exist in the future, but we're nowhere near them now, I don't think, with crime and policing data.
Is there anything else about the real-time crime database that we didn't cover that you would want the layperson to know about, how they can interact with it? Because we've talked about this as something for policymakers or officials or police officials? How can regular people interact with this data?
I should give the website, realtimecrimeindex.com is the website. I would, suggest people head there. That's the best place for gaining access to the data. I think we covered most of it. It's an exciting project, and it's a constantly evolving project. So if people are interested, I certainly recommend they head there and check it out, and love feedback and love hearing what people think about it.
Sounds good. Well, there's going to be a link to your website and your LinkedIn in the show notes. I would suggest that everybody follows, subscribes to the Substack, checks out what Jeff is putting out. It's really very accessible information that's easy to follow and kind of tells some stories that are much different from what you might see on the news or what you might hear from kind of people's anecdotal opinions about crime. So Jeff Asher, he's an expert crime data analyst. He's the co-founder of Datalytics. Their website is below, as well as the Real-Time Crime Index. Jeff, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.